Welcome, all of you. Thank you for being here. Patrick, I'm going to start with you and just dive right into things. For many years now, the Pew Research Center has been asking Americans about their views on China. Last year, 60% of Americans had unfavorable views, the highest on record. 26% had favorable views, the lowest on record. China is also the country most cited as a threat to the US in the future. So let me just get right to it and ask you, to what extent then is China a threat to the United States and its interests around the world?
Well, thank you for that question. It's an honor to be here and with a great panel discussion. There's no precise answer to that question. The way I think about the China challenge is that China poses an acute challenge, but also an opportunity. Both are inseparable in many ways, to deal with three major groups of issues that we're trying to grapple with. One of them is the set of what we could call global issues, pandemics. That's very topical right now with the coronavirus. Climate change, we could go on. Another set of threats is really from a bottom-up threat. My wife's got a new book that's just been shortlisted for the Lionel Gelber Prize, Best Book in Foreign Affairs, and it's called Power to the People, and it's really about how technology is empowering both potential lethal and disruptive attacks from terrorist groups.
You're going to win brownie points tonight.
Well, no, I mean it's a great book, and I take it to seriously. So before I talk to China, I'm letting you know I don't just focus on the China challenge and the China opportunity. We have to deal with all of these things. It's holistic, it's broad. I know we've only got a few minutes, but I have to share that agenda. But now I get to what I do consider the most acute challenge that my children will be facing for the rest of this century, and that is the challenge that revisionist powers, we can call them different words. I'm using shorthand that's in the national security strategy. We can quibble with it, but the point is, those countries, the four countries, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, from my perspective, from U.S. interest perspective, more or less independently, but nonetheless share a desire to change the rule set of the post-war rules and order, and also they want to eliminate the U.S. security architecture that was created. Now, both of those things deserve maybe to be adapted, but that's not what they're offering. They're offering sort of a favorable rule set for China. Look at what they do in the South China Sea with the they don't just violate the rules, right? They create new rules. So if you're the People's Armed Force Maritime Militia, you are the third Navy of China, but you're not called a Navy. But you go out and you ram the Vietnamese, you ram the Filipinos, you leave them in the ocean, in the sea, and you declare that the 9-dash line and a code of conduct should apply to China controls the resources and the military resources and exercises in the region. I've just put out a new report called Total Competition, published by the Center for New American Security, along with my colleague Ryan Newhart. And I spell out why the China challenge is total competition. I meant to contrast it to total war. It's not war, but it's a total competition, so it's more than just one dimension. It's more than information. It's more than maritime and military. It's more than economic. China mostly wants economic goals, as I state in there. So it's an economic strategy, but it's technologically driven. And if we lose the ability to have high capabilities in information-based high technologies like telecommunications, 5G indeed, we're going to lose out there. But they're going to, anyway, this is a multifaceted challenge. We need China for the opportunities. We need them for trade. But we have to protect our critical technologies. We have to protect freedom of navigation. We have to protect a rules-based system with like-minded countries. I know we're going to get to India and other countries where we're trying to share and adapt a rule set for the 21st century. Sorry for the long answer. It's a hard question.
Thank you for that. And we will come to total competition and how to actually deal with China in the best way. But more on that later. Peter, I want to come to you and ask you, again, just about the extent of the threat and whether, given American sentiments right now, it has been exaggerated at all. Because, as we know from the Soviet Union, exaggerating a threat can also lead to all kinds of problems in terms of an arms race or other conflicts that you get involved in that you don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, with all due respect, I think starting the conversation with threat is the wrong way to start the conversation. And it's symptomatic of a kind of backwardness that tends to afflict American foreign policy, something that afflicted American policy during the Cold War as well, something that George Kennan was deeply concerned about. George Kennan would always say, tell me what our interests are first, and then I can tell you what the threats are, right? But if the threat conversation comes first, before the interest conversation, which it so often does in Washington, then what happens is exactly what happened in American containment policy, which is our interests become defined by whatever our adversary is doing. So if our adversary moves in this place, therefore we must have an interest in stopping in that place, right? It's that logic which led us into the Vietnam War. Right, and I think is particularly dangerous with China. So I think the conversation we need to have is what are our crucial interests vis-a-vis China. And when it seems to me where I would start that conversation, the things that China could do or that threaten the United States the most, the first by a long way would be how they handle climate change. Right? I wouldn't put that as one of the three. I would put that in a completely different order of magnitude of all the others, right? Since it seems to me that is the sole existential threat to the population of the United States. Maybe we're learning that pandemics could also be a kind of a 1B in that category, right? But that seems to me far, far more dramatically dangerous. I face the prospect, I think all of us face the prospect, that it's possible that our kids' schools will be closed in the coming weeks, right? It seems to me if one is trying to center American conversation about China on the interests and concerns of ordinary people, right? As American foreign policy has to be grounded in that. That we face the possibility that southern Manhattan, where I live, will flood every time it rains in the coming years, right? That seems to me a far higher order of magnitude in terms of our relationship with China than whether they construct islands in the South China Sea. And I'm not saying we should ignore that altogether, but the reason I'm saying is this, that it seems to me, given the ways in which China can threaten us most directly, the answers are much more likely to come in terms of cooperation than competition, because the greatest threats are not zero-sum. The greatest threats are ones that we have to build institutions to solve together.
Thanks for that, Peter. I think we can already see a lot of difference among you and Patrick on this panel. Rachel, I'm going to bring you in. And again, I want to move all of this towards what we should do instead of just defining the terms here. But Rachel, I know that your area of expertise is the South China Seas and the maritime order there. And part of the issue as well there is that each of China, Japan, India, and the US have different interpretations and definitions of what freedom of navigation actually is. Basically, the laws of the sea. Explain that, if you will.
Yeah, so one thing I just want to highlight first on what Peter was just saying is that the poll you cited at the beginning from the Chicago Council, although it showed that threat concerns about China have risen and it's at the top of the list among countries, it's still way down the list in terms of American people's top foreign policy issues. I think it was like 8 out of
and it was Pew Research.
Pew. So this, I think it just underscores Peter's point that among the American people, the rise of China is not perceived as a serious threat to American interests. It's in the elite foreign policy establishment that you see this acute concern rising now.
And before you go on, actually, why the discrepancy then?
Yeah,
why that divergence between public perception and expert perception?
So I think that a big part of this is that what American foreign policy elites tend to do is draw upon the sort of established rhetoric and narratives and historical analogies that are available to then make sense of new developments in the world. But the fact is that we're entering a period in the world where we've never actually been here before. I mean, really, it's only been a few hundred years that we've had a globally integrated consciousness, and during most of that time, most of the world was either not integrated into that system or was dominated by European colonial powers. So really, we've only had a system in which the world consisted of independent, self-governed nation states for about 50 years. And in that time period, in the last couple of decades, a lot of countries that were formerly dominated by European American colonialism have started to rise, have started to increase their market share and their economic power, and they've started to trade with each other. And that's decreasing our leverage at the same time that our relative power is declining, and we're also dealing with a lot of domestic malaise at home. So I think that among American foreign policy elites, there's a lot of anxiety. And so we reach for analogies to the Cold War, to past power transitions, to great power competition, when those really aren't even applicable because they're from periods in history where we didn't have these same dynamics operating. So I think that's where this sort of threat inflation comes from. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that China does pose certain threats, but its military power is increasing, its presence in the region is increasing, certainly its authoritarianism at home is increasing. But I guess my argument is that China's abroad, its foreign policy behavior is basically typical of a rising power. Of course, rising powers always want to revise some aspects of the system, but so does the United States, and we constantly do that, and we actually reject many aspects of the international order. So I think it has to do with the fact that we have an unprecedented challenge in responding to a really different type of global environment. But I guess back to your point on the South China Sea, I mean, this is certainly doesn't even register on the list of concerns among most Americans. But it certainly is, I think, has been a big driver of anxiety within the foreign policy establishment. But I think the problem is that we tend to misperceive this issue. We see it as an issue of freedom of navigation and the rules-based liberal international order, when that's really not it. China actually has not posed any threat to freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. They've never interfered with commercial shipping in the region. What they have done is interfered with resource extraction in areas where they claim those resources. So this is really a dispute about resources. It's a dispute about territory. And those are disputes on which the United States doesn't take a position, and we shouldn't. And what we instead should be doing is, instead of using them to drive wedges between China and other countries in the region, we need to be using them we should be trying to encourage these countries to neutralize those disputes, to find status quo arrangements that work for both sides. And I think, the irony is that on the actual freedom of navigation and maritime order issues, most of these countries disagree with us and actually agree with China more on sort of what kind of foreign military activities should be permissible in the region or along countries' coasts. And so when we harp on those issues and try to make it into this big matter of revisionism and the rules-based order, we kind of damage our own credibility, because most countries in the region know that's not really what we're trying to do.
Sure. It's very interesting, Patrick, how you're sitting so far away from Peter. I mean,
I sat here, he sat there.
Whichever way that worked out, it's very interesting. But, in a sense, we're playing out the Thucydides trap. I mean, so you have a hegemon, and you have a rising power, and then you have a sense of displacement, which then could inevitably lead to conflict between them. Patrick,
I don't accept those premises, by the way. As you expect, I see a much more nuanced sense of history. We are in a bounded competition with China. Let me just agree with a couple of things Peter said. First of all, climate change and the urgency, absolutely. And if you're a millennial, if you're thinking about the millennial demographic of America now equaling the baby boomer generation, if you're not concerned about this, then you're in the wrong room. So I agree with you about the urgency of that. I didn't, of course, ask the threat question first.
I wasn't
right?
criticizing you.
And so that's why I'm using the word competition, because but it is a total competition, and it's much more than the South China Sea, by the way. The South China Sea was just one illustration. The fact that China, Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party, wants to turn the South China Sea into a domestic lake for all intents and purposes is a matter of international rules importance, and is important for the United States and our allies and partners. But that's just one illustration. Again, my total competition report talks about the breadth of this. This is an information-driven strategy. This is a techno-nationalist strategy of the Chinese Communist Party, and we have no counter for it.
Sum it up quickly, because in that report you describe a sort of a two-pronged strategy.
Well, for us,
of
we
engaging with China.
So, and this is where I agree with Peter as well.
So quickly, what is that two-pronged?
You always need to start with what we stand for. And I correct my conservative friends immediately when they tell me what they're against. Wait, to stand back, all right, I'm with you, but tell me first what you're for. What are we trying to create here? What's then realistic for us to create? All right, is it a realistic goal? Just because it's good and you want to do it doesn't mean it's realistic. And that's where we could probably find a lot of common room in this ground among people who think differently about these policy issues if we had an honest debate about those things, because we're actually trying to achieve much of the same thing. We don't always have the same sense of what's realistic, how do we get there, but it would eliminate a lot. My two-pronged strategy is that we do have to protect critical technologies like telecommunications. We do need to counter malign behavior and rhetoric, and foreign influence. And we haven't done that very well. That's not recreating a Cold War, but it is becoming competitive in the information space broadly defined, from technology to intellectual property to education and research. And that's what we need to do. It's in the report. But at the same time, we have to engage China. We have to engage China even on the hard security issues, because we're not looking for an unintended war. We're not looking for artificial intelligence and hypersonic weapons to drive us into an accidental war, for God forbid. We share a common interest, and we share a common interest with all the so-called revisionist powers on that issue. So it's not zero-sum. But at the same time, we need to figure out how to engage on trade. That's why we don't decouple completely, but there has to be some disentangling of some critical technologies, because we need to be able to rely on those technologies for security as well. We can disagree on that, but that's where I disentangle, on the economic trade side. We clearly need to cooperate on the global issues. And yes, climate change. This should not be a political issue, all right? As somebody who works in a conservative think tank, and I'm center-right, I believe that climate change is a global issue. It's not a Republican Democratic issue. It's not a political issue. Maybe when you get to the prescriptions, there are more or less different kinds of answers we could have. But we shouldn't be disagreeing on that subject. And I agree with you on that. And I know I'm in a minority in the camp where I'm sitting on that issue, okay? So we need to bridge this gap and bring everybody along with this discussion. So that's one reason why I'm here today. I'm
Sure.
In addition
Sure.
to being paid the big bucks for.
Sure.
Okay.
We didn't get the memo on that one. Peter, look, we're here to discuss new visions new visions for Washington to deal with the world, to engage with the world. What are the things that you think we could tangibly change in terms of how Washington engages Beijing?
I mean, I think that one thing that that's very important is when we talk about China threatening, being a revisionist power and threatening the kind of international rules-based liberal order, right? I think that conversation doesn't have nearly enough self-consciousness about the degree to which we have been a threat to that order, right? And it seems to me, if we want to have credibility in talking about things like Chinese violations of international law in the South China Sea, we have to think about the degree to which the United States, particularly under the Trump administration, has really become a kind of wrecking ball, I think, for international institutions and for kind of a rules-based order, right? From withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal to withdrawing from the Paris climate change agreement to, the Chinese government is brutally repressive at home, and I think they have a very hard-nosed, self-interested foreign policy, right? But I mean, it is worth just noting, right, that it is the United States which has launched numerous wars in recent decades, some of them without UN Security Council approval, right? Whereas if you think about what the hallmark of the rules-based international order was, one of them was precisely about not launching wars, right, without the approval of the United Nations, right? Or at least unless you were in imminent attack. China hasn't actually been doing that, right? And so I think that degree of self-consciousness is something that's really, really important to bring into the conversation. The way in which the Trump administration is destroying destroying the World Trade Organization by refusing to allow them to appoint new judges, so there can't be any arbitration, right? So China, I think, if we're going to build a new rules-based order, China has to be a very important stakeholder, right? They're already contributing a lot to things like peacekeeping and other things. We need them to be a big stakeholder. They're going to have a major seat at the table, but we have to also accept that the rules-based international order binds us as well if we want it to bind China and other countries. And that, I think, particularly in the Trump administration, has been completely lacking from this conversation.
Sure, and I mean, this is a moment where that point resonates even more than it would have in years past. But point taken. Let me shift this a little bit because, on the one hand, what you're describing about China in terms of its foreign policy, in terms of its influence, is one thing. But take, for example, how the Belt and Road Initiative works. And Rachel, I'm going to put this to you. It's essentially an arm of Chinese foreign policy. And while in the last couple of years we haven't seen anything the likes of which happened in Sri Lanka, where China was able to take over the port of Habantora, we've seen other things. So, for example, in the last month, Pakistan, for example, shut down flights to and from China because it was worried about spreading or getting the coronavirus within its borders. it gets a call from Beijing, and then 3 days later, flights resume. There is a pressure that Beijing is able to impose and put to bear on its neighbors, in part because of the aid that it brings to the table. Ignore that we're in the moment we're in right now. So let's say we're, a year down the line. How can Washington better engage with China on those issues? What can it do differently?
Yeah, so I think this raises an important point that China is, as its power rises, as its military presence rises, and especially its economic integration with countries throughout the world and in the Asia Pacific and their dependence upon China, it is using that leverage, that increased leverage, to pursue its interests, to pressure countries in disputes that relate to what China perceives to be its core interests. And its ability to do that is increasing as its power grows. And so I think when we see this through a lens of bipolar competition, where we try to use our alliances and relationships with countries in the region to build an alliance network that can contain China, we really miss the boat, because most of these countries don't want to have to choose between China and the United States. They economically depend on China more than they depend on us. That horse has left the barn. That's not going to change, and that dynamic will deepen in coming years. But they want to be able to maintain outside options, and I think the United.
But not all of them. For example, I mean, for India, the United States is a bigger sort of importer than China right now. So,
yes,
and President Trump was just there.
Yes, so it's not universally true, and I think, but India's sort of dependence upon trade with China and trade with the United States is less as a share of its economy than a lot of countries in the region. So, maybe their dependence is a little less, and I think that Japan and Australia maybe have more outside options, and I think because they have stronger economic relations with other countries. But when you look at a lot of other countries in Asia, and I think that's a good thing, right? Like we want to enable countries to maintain the ability to resist Chinese influence, and that might sort of violate their sort of fundamental political interests and sovereignty. So I think that that's a positive thing. Pursuing economic arrangements and other sorts of arrangements with these countries is a good thing. But I think that shouldn't be exclusive of a more inclusive approach to the region, that where we realize that on a wide range of issues, the only way that we can achieve our goals effectively is to pursue regional governance that is inclusive of China, as well as India and Japan and Southeast Asia, ASEAN. And for about at least a decade, the way the United States has been approaching regional governance and engagement is either through creating arrangements that are exclusive of China and designed to sort of counterbalance Chinese influence, or engaging in organizations where China is present, like ASEAN-centered institutions, with the purpose of competing against China. And I think that the fact that we're using all of this engagement for a competitive purpose is leading us to put the wrong emphasis on our engagement, when oftentimes we need to instead be working with China and other countries to address a lot of non-traditional security challenges.
And your bet is that most other South Asian and Southeast Asian nations would welcome that kind of an approach from Washington.
I think it's especially true in Southeast Asia and in South Korea, where they would welcome an approach that's more inclusive. And there will be still be some arrangements that are not inclusive of China. There will be some arrangements that are not inclusive of the United States, like the trilateral arrangement between China, Japan, and South Korea. And that's the nature of sort of overlapping regional infrastructure. And I think that's fine. And that shouldn't give us heartburn. That's just that's the nature of it. But I think that yes, they would welcome a scenario in which they can sort of have a strong relationship with both the United States and China. And even Japan and India, I think, would welcome that kind of approach. And yes, they're going to lean towards the United States, and that's fine. That's
which is the Quad, essentially.
Yeah. Well, but I think that sometimes the United States puts a little too much hope in the Quad. I think, especially on the part of India, it has a strong interest to maintain independence, and sometimes it's not much more than lip service, I think. But
Sure. I'm going to come to our audience for questions in a second. I just have one more question that I want to get in. Patrick, I'll put this to you. We haven't talked about technology, and there's a theory that the likes of Amazon and Google are helping to counter China's technological and geopolitical rise simply because they're American companies. Is that true?
Is it true that there's a perception?
Well,
Or
do,
you-
do you buy that theory?
No, it's not that simple. I've been working with the technology companies in terms of talking to them. My wife has as well when talking about counterterrorism. And you even talk to the people who deal with these issues within those companies, and they're outliers within those companies. Those companies have a brain of their own. They're working on bottom line. They're working on new technologies. They're multinational in many ways, and they're based around the world. So it's really just too simplistic to try to categorize them. But what we do need to do is to work on what comprises a trusted technology value chain, what comprises trusted technologies when you're dealing with 5G, for instance, and things that are that important. How do we get to a rule set on emerging technologies? Because even if we talk about nuclear weapons or old systems, we're being outdated by artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cislunar space development. There are a lot of things that are happening in the 2020s that we need to be focused on. Technology companies outside of government are driving most of these, especially for the United States or outside of China. That's the difference. China has this state capitalism, has a military civil fusion system, and has a state of law, a law that forces Huawei and others. That's why there's so much criticism inside the government toward Huawei, because whatever they're doing, they're unfortunately subject to a different law. And I think that's the concern, is that you want to be caught up in that 10 years from now when you're completely dependent on that telecommunication system, and people dealing with security would rather not. They'd rather have some options. So we have to think about what's most important, how do we work with others, and this is where you could fault again the need to work with allies and partners and like-minded, need to bring in the private sector, you need to have a dialogue, and we're clearly not doing enough of that.
Sure.
It should have, I just came back from London and Oxford, and talking to the British about the 5G decision, for instance, they made to accept some Huawei into their system. From a U.S. perspective, I think they made the wrong decision. But from a British perspective, I definitely understand why it's wrong to browbeat one of our closest allies after we didn't give them much of an alternative. We didn't anticipate this. We should have anticipated that this was going to be a challenge. So we're at fault as much as anyone for letting us get into this situation if that's really a matter of concern for national security.
Thanks, Patrick. Let's take questions from you in the audience here. If you can raise your hands, we'll get a mic to you. The gentleman over there. And then we'll also take one over there, one of the last rows there. Yes, sir, over there.
Hi, I wanted to talk about Taiwan. I'm kind of surprised we haven't talked about it. For the last 70 years, the Chinese government has said that we're going to take Taiwan in some shape or form, and I would argue in our lifetime that will happen. The question is, American foreign policy towards Taiwan been so ambiguous that gets us in some significant trouble? And what should our policy be regarding Taiwan?
Thank you for that. We'll take one more question and then address them together. Yep, over there.
Hi, I'm actually from CUNY as well, so represent CUNY. My question is about Latin America, in particular how China has been able to expand its influence and expand its presence commercially as well. And how is that going to force the United States to reconsider its approach to the region? Thanks.
Thank you. Rachel, would you like to field either of them?
Yeah, sure. So I think first on the Taiwan issue, I think that the most important priority of the United States in the Taiwan issue should be to preserve a peaceful status quo, right? So I think the best way to do that is to maintain a policy of sort of dual deterrence, where we try to deter Taiwan from taking any action that might give Beijing an excuse, in particular something like declaring, de jure independence, but at the same time deterring China from taking action against Taiwan. Now that's been our strategy for a long time. Of course, as time goes on, the structural imbalance in the relationship, the military balance across the relationship is worsening. So Taiwan's economic dependence is only increasing over time, and Beijing's conventional military advantage is increasing as well. But I think that there are still ways that Taiwan could increase, especially its indigenous defense capabilities, and really invest in sort of making itself a porcupine, is the analogy that's often used. And I think those are the kind of technologies that the United States should support Taiwan to develop indigenously, so that we have the option as time goes on to engage in a dialogue with Beijing and Taipei over how perhaps we could reach some sort of arrangement where China agrees to draw down its troops and that are poised to make some sort of invasion against Taiwan, but Taiwan feels that it has enough security to also make some sort of accept some sort of political arrangement that would be a very robust version of one country, two systems. I think that that's less likely in light of how Beijing has handled Hong Kong, and that's obviously to China's discredit. So I think the prospects for that are not particularly strong in the short term, but it's still something that, we're not at the end of history, and because of these fundamental structural dynamics and the fact that Taiwan does have the ability to significantly raise the costs of a unilateral Chinese invasion without any pretext, I think that there still will be interests on the Chinese side in reaching some sort of a peaceful, eventually, some sort of peaceful resolution of the situation. So.
And Latin America, either of you want to field that?
I'd prefer to speak on Taiwan, so maybe I don't know if.
I'll prefer to speak on Taiwan, which is,
I don't know enough about Chinese influence in Latin America to say anything intelligent, and one of the things I'm trying to do,
Which is just
be more
fine.
honest.
That's okay. We can leave it there.
I will just say one thing on the Caribbean, not Latin America per se, but the Caribbean, because the Chinese came out and made a statement last year that the Belt and Road Initiative financing for infrastructure in places like the Caribbean, in the South Pacific, should take on now a military follow-on. That should concern American national security, because that's a direct issue. It also suggests that their economic investments have more than economics in mind, and that should be an opener as well. And it is to Australia and to others in Asia in the South Pacific. That's why there were actions taken last year in the South Pacific.
Sure. We'll take a couple more questions. The gentleman in the beige jacket here. Anyone else? I see one more over there. Yes, sir, in the tie. You have a mic making its way to you. Go ahead.
John McAuliffe from the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. One observation is that I think too little attention is paid to the total transformation of U.S. relations with Vietnam. We're reaching the 25th anniversary of normalization, and Vietnam has not changed in any sense that seems to drive the U.S. about other countries in terms of governance, but at any rate, that's my larger question has to do with paradigms, and this is an old-fashioned paradigm, but maybe still relevant, which is simply hegemonism. In a very simplistic way, China is to the South China Sea and Taiwan, as Russia is to Ukraine and Georgia, and as the U.S. is to Cuba and Venezuela. The assumption, the sort of moral assumption that they know what's better for the countries in our periphery than they know for themselves.
Okay, and the gentleman there in a tie.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, to what extent does the consensus around the U.S. foreign policy community lean towards the idea that China's model of governance is fundamentally illegitimate in the same way it saw the Soviet Union during the early days of the Cold War? Or to what extent is it more practical and pragmatic about sort of challenging China but also coexisting with China? Or is it about fundamentally changing their model from the inside over time? Thank you.
It's almost overwhelmingly pragmatic. It's a minority view. I mean, there are a lot of, I've got some friends who definitely want to change the system, but it's a distinct minority view. It's not the policy view. It's not even the main heart of the policy right now.
Just to go to the first question. When the United States emerged as a great power, we developed a sphere of influence, right? The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt-Carr to the Monroe Doctrine, we sent our troops into the Caribbean and Central America a great deal in order to impose our will on the countries to the south of us. When I think it's worth going back, I think at this moment, to looking at the debates inside the United States about the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe after World War II, right? I mean, the United States unhappily acquiesced to a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe after World War II. It acquiesced in the sense that it was not willing to go to war with the Soviet Union for Eastern Europe, right? And that led to horrible and tragic events, right? Like the Soviets sending their tanks into Hungary in 1956 and into Czechoslovakia in 1968, and the United States watching it happen, essentially, right? Because we were not willing to go to war. And I think that when we talk about China as a rising power, that like other rising powers will expect to have more of a sphere of influence than it has had in the past, we're going to have to face some pretty hard and tragic realities, right? About the fact that China will develop more of a sphere of influence in East Asia than it does today. If you look at Graham Allison's work on the Thucydides trap, right, and he looks about the cases that have led to war and the cases that have not led to war. One of the points he makes is that in the cases that have not led to war, it has required wrenching changes to the international system by the status quo power, right, in addition to the rising power, right? So I think, to go back to the question of Taiwan, Taiwan is an inspiring success story, morally, right? It's a country that I think all Americans should cheer, right? For Taiwan to be put in the situation that Hong Kong is in now would be an unmitigated moral tragedy, right? I think those are, and we should do whatever we can to prevent that from happening. But there also has to be a willingness to be honest. In the same way that American policymakers were honest in the 1950s and 60s, it was to say that at the end of that, our policies have to be premised on the baseline understanding, right? And the baseline understanding is we will not go to war with China for Taiwan, and we cannot win that war, right? And it seems to me, unless one can be honest about that conversation, one can't make good policy making, and one isn't actually doing Taiwan any favors. And I think that goes for Vietnam too, by the way.
Thank you, Peter. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time, but those are wise words to chew on at the very end about the United States as a status quo power. I'm going to hand over to Trita Parsi next, but for now, please show your thanks to Patrick Cronin, Peter Beinart, Rachel Odell. Thank you, everyone.